Well, welcome. My name is John Tobin. I'm Professor in the Law School and Director of the Human Rights Program. Thanks so much for braving the elements tonight. We're a bit worried about this time of the year. Melbourne, winter, freezing cold, but Philip's clearly drawn a crowd, so thanks so much for coming this evening. As many of you know, we meet today on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. And now to our guest speaker. Many of you know Professor Philip Alston. He's a very regular visitor to this law school. I think has spoken for the last 4 or 5 years on various topics. Philip has occupied numerous roles in the UN system. Currently, he was appointed by the Human Rights Council in 2014 as the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. That mandate requires him to identify approaches for removing all obstacles to the full enjoyment of human rights for people living in extreme poverty. He's also worked as the Special Advisor to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the Millennium Development Goals and Chairperson Rapporteur of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. He's taught at various schools around the world, the European University Institute, the ANU, Harvard Law School, Fletcher School of Diplomacy, and he's currently a professor at NYU, where he co-directs the Centre for Global Justice and Human Rights. Philip is also a former student of Melbourne Law School, and I'm hoping today that many of you out there will also be students right now and be inspired by Philip's journey and his work. So hopefully that will be one of the benefits of this evening's lecture as well. He's also on annual leave, and so I've coaxed him back from the beach, balmy Melbourne, down at Shoreham, with his family and friends to come up this evening and address us in his spare time. So I think it's, again, an indication of Philip's commitment to this space, but also to this law school as well. He's prepared to come on a very cold, wet, miserable Melbourne evening and share his thoughts in this area with us. So without me talking any further, I'd like to introduce Professor Philip Alston to address the issue of the rise of populism and the future of human rights. Please make Phil welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much, John. It's a great pleasure to be here. Many long years ago since I graduated. I won't go down that road, but Melbourne Law School clearly does wonderful things, and it's fantastic that it can manage to put on a lecture like this which draws such an audience. I'll see if I can put you all to sleep as a reward. I'm talking tonight about really the major challenges that exist as a result of political developments over the last couple of years. I'm not talking about anything Australia specific, although there are clearly some lessons in here for us as well as for other countries. My starting point is to suggest, to try to be commercially relevant, that if Human Rights Inc. could be listed on the stock exchange, its share price would have fallen dramatically over the past year or so. Not just a result of the US election or of Brexit, but a confluence of diverse developments that has left the human rights enterprise in a much more difficult situation than it was even a couple of years ago. I'm not going to go into the meaning of the term populism in any detail. It's something of a placeholder. I'm happy to take the definition put forward by Jan Werner Muller, who wrote a book on the subject, describes it basically as the opposite of pluralism. He says populists claim a moral monopoly of representation to speak on behalf of the people, with the result that all other political contenders are accused of being illegitimate. A closely related term is illiberal democracies. The list of such states is growing. I'm not going to go into them in any detail. We know the European examples perhaps best in a way, ironically, which we wouldn't have expected. Turkey, Poland, Hungary, India, Israel, Brazil, and a range of others are not far behind. None of these necessarily would have been expected to be heading in that direction just a couple of years ago. I want to take one particular chilling example just as a way of starting off and putting it into context, and that's the Philippines. About 10 years ago now, I visited the Philippines in my capacity then as UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. I put together a pretty powerful case that demonstrated that a lot of the killings that were taking place of leftists and others were basically being carried out by the Philippines military as a matter of policy. I presented my findings to the then president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and she responded by saying, "What can be done?" And the answer was simply, "You need to send a message to the military to stop it." She did, and they did. Killings dropped by over 50% and went down even further in the years subsequently. There was reason to think that the democracy that Filipinos had fought to retake for themselves by throwing out Ferdinand Marcos in 1986 was alive, was responsive, and was capable of dealing with issues like this. But during the same visit, I spent an hour in Davao City with the man who was then the mayor, Rodrigo Duterte. We met late at night in a hotel, not that he drinks, and we had a very animated discussion about allegations that a death squad was operating in Davao City and had killed hundreds of people, many of them children, street children, undesirables, irritating children, people that the elites wanted to get rid of. It was very clear, and I subsequently reported to the Human Rights Council, that nothing happened in Davao City without the approval of the mayor. He told me that himself. And that the death squad was under pretty clear instructions to clean up the city. Basically, it worked. People liked Duterte because he achieved results. The brutality got rid of the undesirables, and if you needed anything, you knew where to go, to the mayor. I assumed that exposing these practices would have an impact. I was wrong. Nothing happened. The Philippines government didn't respond. The Philippines Human Rights Commission did nothing. And Mayor Duterte thrived and was eventually elected president of the Philippines. I'll come back to that situation at the end of my talk and make it relevant, more relevant. The populist agenda that has made such dramatic inroads in the last couple of years is generally nationalistic, xenophobic, misogynistic, and of course explicitly antagonistic to all or much of the human rights agenda. In addition, of course, to the populist countries, there are many others that could be classified not as populist democracies, but countries that are also actively seeking to undermine the human rights system as we know it. The result is a very different landscape. I think as a result of that, what we see is that the challenges that the human rights movement now face are fundamentally different from what we've seen in the past. This doesn't mean, as some scholars have told us, that the end times of human rights are near. It doesn't mean that human rights are so compromised by their liberal elite association that they are of little use. And it doesn't mean that we're in a post-human rights era, all claims made by different scholars. Nor does it mean that we should all despair and move on, or that there's a desperate need, as another scholar wrote, to find tools other than human rights with which to combat these new challenges. But it does mean that human rights proponents need to rethink many of their assumptions, reevaluate their strategies, and broaden their outreach while not giving up on the basic principles. One thing that's certain is unpredictability. Few targets will be off limits in the years ahead. The coalitions that will form will be more diverse than in the past. They'll be less focused on particular issues. They'll be more willing to depart from established understandings and conventions, and they'll be less constrained by appeals to behave responsibly or in line with their legal obligations. I'm not going to speak about the Western countries in any detail, but it has to be said that the departure of the United States from the group of countries that could be counted upon to defend human rights in at least certain situations, and the very significant weakening of the European Union as a force for good in the human rights field have also made a dramatic difference to the landscape that I'm describing. In working out how to go forward, there are a number of general principles that I think we need to keep in mind. The first is to acknowledge that defending human rights has never been a consensus project. It's always been the product of struggle. The modern human rights regime emerged out of the ashes of the deepest authoritarian dysfunction and the greatest conflagration the world had ever seen. It has duelled with and been shaped by the eras of reluctant decolonization, the Cold War, neoliberalism, and now populism. Dejection and despair are pointless and self-defeating. Human rights is not a lost cause, but we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that it's ever going to be a winning cause. It's an ongoing struggle. That is the nature of human rights. Second, this is the start of a long-term effort. It won't be over in 4 years. It won't be over with a new election in the United States. The main characteristic of the populists and the authoritarians is precisely disdain for social conventions, a currency on which respect for human rights norms has long been heavily dependent. The devaluation of that currency opens up immense horizons for the enemies of human rights. Third, and I'll return to this, the human rights movement needs to develop a spirit of introspection and openness. Historically, that community hasn't responded well to criticism. What are some of the principal challenges? These will not be new to you, but it's useful just to lay out a few before I offer some prescriptions as to where I think we need to start moving. The first challenge is a major threat to democracy. This is a complex phenomenon. Much of it is linked to post-9/11 security concerns, some of which have blended seamlessly into an actual or constructed fear and hatred of foreigners or minorities. We've seen the alleged ban in the United States clearly motivated by a link between a particular religion and the whole terrorist threat, designed to calculate and respond to a fear of a particular group. The resulting concerns have been exploited to justify huge trade-offs. This is not only a strategy pursued by governments of many different stripes, but one that's been sold with remarkable success to the broader public. People are now widely convinced that security can be achieved only through making enormous trade-offs, whether in terms of freedom of movement, privacy, non-discrimination norms, or even personal integrity guarantees. The new era of internal threats, which have dramatically increased in recent years, is bringing with it a move to normalize states of emergency. In France, there's been very little comment about a draconian state of emergency declared in response to the significant terrorist attacks in that country. Those measures are gradually just evolving into the new normal. An American commentator wrote a few days ago that she believes that the United States is effectively now in a state of emergency. She pointed to the fact that immediately after 9/11, the Patriot Act was enacted, which imposed draconian limits, but it was only for 5 years. 14 of the 16 measures in that have suddenly been adopted as a normal part of American law. Post 9/11, the United States adopted what's called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, a congressional act. It was to enable American forces to attack Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. It has subsequently been used to attack virtually any terrorist group anywhere in the world. It's essentially an emergency measure. Surveillance in the United States, the various protections that were set up, special court, regular courts, have led to the rejection of almost none of the major measures to extend surveillance in ways that would not have been tolerated just a few years ago. And finally, restrictive interpretations of freedom of information legislation, stunning anti-protest legislation. If the police or a motorist run over a protester on the road, they won't be liable in some states. What sort of invitation do you think that is? And finally, the bypassing of the role of Congress through the ever-growing use of executive orders. So the suggestion by that commentator is that the United States has already gone down that path of moving towards setting in place an emergency system which bypasses human rights. I have to say, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but it's something that certainly strikes me when I come back to Australia, which I do very regularly. I'm always struck by reading one particular newspaper which bears the name of the country. If ever a newspaper is determined to play up, to frighten, to scare a population, it's that one. The headlines that are available on a daily basis are clearly designed to move the general populace in this direction. I think it's extremely important for us to try very hard to maintain a balanced perspective and not to give up what we hold most dear in response to the forces that would like to impose a much more authoritarian system, not because they fear terrorism, but because there is a broader agenda. It's not just in countries that are already in turmoil that there's a declining faith in democracy. There was a study done by a couple of authors last year, suggested 3 tests to assess the robustness of democracy. The first is the extent of public support. In other words, how important is it for people that their country remains democratic? Second is the openness of the public to the possibility of a non-democratic government, gauged in terms of whether individuals would countenance military rule if needs be. If things went really wrong in Australia, would we countenance a role for the military in the governance of the country? The third test is the extent to which anti-system parties and movements have grown within the society. Based on these criteria, the authors argue that there is, in fact, already a radical diminution in the support for democracy in many of the established democracies. In other words, there's a growing openness to considering alternatives which might be seen to offer a happier future. The second major issue is the role of civil society. It's now fashionable among human rights proponents to decry the fact that the space for civil society is shrinking. But that phrase is generally a euphemism because in many countries that space has closed. The opportunities for civil society to operate are being closed down, and very effectively so in many countries. When I made an official visit to China just on a year ago, I discovered that the authorities had sent a loud and clear message to civil society actors, as well as to academics, that none of them was to speak with me. It worked. They didn't. One of those with whom I did manage to meet was a well-known human rights lawyer named Zhang Tianyong. He was subsequently arrested and has been charged with crimes that are sure to bring very severe penalties. Others who did speak and meet with me were subsequently harassed systematically. And in case the powers of the security services prove insufficient, the government has adopted a law in China making it virtually impossible for any but entirely innocuous foreign NGOs to work in that country, as well as a separate law regulating charities, which leaves funding for human rights work entirely at the government's discretion. Between them, those new laws and regulations have basically succeeded in closing all space for any human rights groups. But it's not just China, it's not just Russia, the famous foreign agent law, where if you get any money from or you have any association with an external actor, you have to declare yourself to be a foreign agent. It's countries like India, where civil society space is disappearing very, very rapidly. It's countries like Israel, where civil society space is almost closed. Again, this is stunning, given the situation, given the reputation of those countries not so long ago. The third issue is the linkage between inequality and exclusion. Populism is driven in part by fear and resentment. To the extent that economic policies are thus critical, it's noteworthy that mainstream human rights advocacy addresses economic and social rights issues in a tokenistic manner at best, and the issue of inequality almost not at all. Similarly, the focus of most human rights advocacy is on marginal and oppressed individuals and minority groups. From our traditional perspective, that's how it should be. They are the ones who most need our help. But the reality is that the majority in society feel that they have no stake in the human rights enterprise, and that human rights groups are really, and this is very apparent in the British newspapers these days, that human rights groups really work for asylum seekers, felons, terrorists, and the like. They don't care about ordinary people. This societal majority seems far less likely today than it might have been in the past to be supportive of the rights of the most disadvantaged, merely out of some disappearing ethos of solidarity. I believe that a renewed focus on social rights and on the need to diminish inequality must be part of a new human rights agenda, which promises to take into account the concerns, indeed the human rights, of those who feel badly done by as a result of what we loosely call globalization-driven economic change. The fourth issue is the undermining of the international rule of law. This is a potentially huge topic. I'd be happy to talk about it later on. I'd mention here only two aspects very briefly. The first is the systematic undermining of the rules governing the international use of force, which the United States and its allies, including Australia, have undertaken since 9/11. Second is the shocking breakdown in respect for the principles of international humanitarian law. In a 2016 poll undertaken by the International Committee of the Red Cross, only 30% of Americans considered it to be unacceptable to torture a captured enemy combatant, quote, to obtain important military information. In the same poll taken in 1999, the figure was 65%. The fifth and final issue concerns the fragility of international institutions set up to protect and promote human rights. The International Criminal Court is under sustained attack, particularly from various African states. The UN, including its vitally important Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is now under attack as a result of major budget cuts foreshadowed by the Trump administration. Where do we go? What sort of response would be helpful? I want to put forward several issues that I think we need to address. First of all, we need to reflect better on how to ensure effective synergies between international and local human rights movements. Take Human Rights Watch, for example, a group that I hugely admire and which is a leader in the field. Its original model relied heavily on the assumption that the US government or Congress, or both, would be responsive to reporting and lobbying, at least in response to significant violations in a reasonable range of countries. It then broadened its template so that recommendations were also addressed to as many other entities as possible, but the basic assumptions remained. As it became more apparent that there is no substitute for also advocating at the country level, it made a huge effort to establish national offices at the country level, as it has in Australia. But it's not clear that the fundamental model has changed significantly, even if the geographical scope has expanded. The deeper challenge that we see is how the activities of international NGOs can have less of what I would call an extractive character, that is, extracting information and leaving, and focus more on building or complementing national capacity. For its part, Amnesty International has undergone dramatic decentralisation, but it's not at all clear to me that it's yet found the best formula for strengthening local and national capacities. And it's increasingly clear that we can no longer rely on one level or the other operating in isolation. There will be times when only international groups can function effectively because the domestic space, as I said before, is completely closed down. There will also be situations in which exclusively international advocacy will be ineffective and maybe even counterproductive. Second, the economics of rights, to go back to the point I made earlier. Economic and social rights must be seen as an important and authentic part of the overall agenda. We need to start insisting in fidelity to the arrangements adopted after World War II in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that human rights consist equally of both categories of rights. That doesn't mean that every human rights group must suddenly devote itself to economic and social rights, but all groups should reflect on ways in which they can constructively contribute to both sides of the agenda. Amnesty International has tried, but they haven't succeeded. They've been reluctant to grasp the real nettle, which is the need to treat economic and social rights as full-fledged human rights. What is not needed is to move the focus to the blight of poverty, or to denials of dignity, or even to the need for more resources for development. We need to go back to the basics of recognising that there are human rights to education, to healthcare, to food, and so on. Third, the human rights community needs to broaden the base. It needs to start expanding its horizons in terms of thinking about which other actors it can work with. The renewed push for privatisation, along with the continuing abdication of governmental responsibility for various functions, guarantees that the huge role already played by corporate actors will only grow in the years ahead. I have to confess that I think that engagement with corporate actors is necessary and indispensable, but at the same time, I've always been deeply sceptical about the proposition that businesses are going to be persuaded to act as great proponents of human rights. While the guiding principles on business and human rights and other such initiatives have achieved a breakthrough in some respects, we also need to begin more of a big picture conversation with the larger corporations about whether an authoritarian, anti-rights and anti-welfare future is really in their interests. They, but also we, need to start thinking about where, how, and when they can legitimately and constructively stand up to policies that cross certain lines, and how they can use their influence and power to make the case for more human rights friendly approaches. And it's not just corporations. The human rights community needs to think more creatively about other potential allies with whom it can cooperate. One could mention in this regard religious movements whose potential has not yet been fully explored by the human rights community, in my view. Fourth, we need to get back to thinking, or to acknowledging, that we have to be persuasive and convincing in human rights advocacy, rather than simply proclaiming human rights principles as though they are self-evidently correct and applicable. There's a certain tendency on the part of human rights groups to lecture, to pontificate, as it were, and not to try to persuade and explain. I had an interesting experience about a year ago. I wrote a report on the responsibility of the UN for bringing cholera to Haiti. In the report, I observed that arguments based on human rights or international law often don't suffice to persuade or to convince member states or even the UN itself to take the necessary steps. I added in my report that those in authority also need to be convinced of the unsustainability and costliness of existing policy and of the feasibility of change. Now, that's something that generally human rights groups don't do. They say it's not for us to try to persuade. We just tell them that they're wrong, and they draw the conclusions. So a human rights defender for whom I've got great respect read this report in draft and urged that I take the statement out on the grounds that the role of human rights proponents precisely is just to state principles and to remind actors of their responsibilities, not to acknowledge that they might need more broad-based encouragement as well. I demurred because I strongly believe that we need to be much more instrumentalist than we have in the past. I think we need to start thinking why the other side is not doing what we consider to be the right thing. In my report on Haiti and the failure over a period of 6 years of the UN to acknowledge its responsibility, I spent most of my time trying to understand what could be motivating the UN in this immoral perspective that it had adopted, and trying then to engage with each of those arguments, not in a moralistic way, but in a way that demonstrated that the arguments were not valid and didn't justify the means that they had adopted. Linked to this approach, of course, I think we need to step back from the absolutism that sometimes manifests itself in our human rights work. We pride ourselves, sometimes rightly and unavoidably, on being uncompromising. We fear that if we make any concessions along the way, we are selling out the basics of human rights. Instead, I think that adopting a more calibrated approach that acknowledges the times in which we live and the context in which we function might also involve breaking with some of the old certainties. Let me give an example which is potentially controversial. It concerns the major threat to the International Criminal Court, which has come from a range of African governments which have been motivated, at least in principle by their opposition to the idea that sitting heads of state are subject to the court's jurisdiction. So the idea that the sitting president of Sudan might have to go to The Hague to face trial, the idea that the elected president of Kenya might have to face trial, was said to be deeply problematic, even offensive to those governments. It has to be said, of course, that one of the great achievements of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court was precisely the fact that it applied to everyone. That if you committed genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, it didn't matter if you were head of state or if you were a mere foot soldier, you could still be prosecuted. So it's an important principle, but it nonetheless seems to me that we might also need to step back for a moment and acknowledge the extraordinary importance of the International Criminal Court enterprise in historical, legal, cultural and other terms, and the fact that there's a huge amount at stake which goes beyond the principle of head of state immunity. The fact is that a great many countries, sitting heads of state, are not able to be prosecuted. We point to the Africans and say, this is not acceptable, you've got to send your president. Do you recall what's been happening with the president of the country in which I currently live? He has got his lawyers working on the fact that he can not only pardon anyone around him, but he can pardon himself. And most American lawyers concede that he could never be prosecuted in the criminal courts for actions taken as president. He can be impeached. In other words, the Congress, in its discretion, might decide politically to do something, but under American law, they're not going to prosecute a sitting president. The French do exactly the same. You accuse the sitting president of a crime, and the prosecutors say, okay, we'll be back in 5 years when the term of office is finished. So why is it that we need to absolutely insist on taking a hard line under the circumstances here? So the question is whether supporters of the ICC shouldn't contemplate making some sort of concession. It would not and should not involve an amendment to the statute, but it could well involve a readiness to consider agreeing that the Security Council can use its existing authority to defer the commencement of any proceedings in such circumstances. This can be done only on a year-by-year basis, but it would respond to the concerns that many states have. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this particular example, but I think we need to start thinking more creatively about what it is that might take some of the wind out of the sails of the political opponents to some of the key initiatives in the field. Finally, the role of scholars. What role of scholars? This is a university. It's a university in which there is a great deal of attention given. There are many courses in human rights and so on. I think we need to ask what the role is that we play. I think as teachers, as researchers, as publicists, we actually have obligations to our students. It's become fashionable, especially at elite universities in the West, to disparage human rights by accentuating in dramatic and sometimes destructive ways the undoubted shortcomings of international human rights norms and institutions. At a range of law schools that I've visited, I've encountered students who have become deeply disillusioned or cynical because they've been taught that the human rights enterprise is largely an illusion, that it's not something they should really be putting their time into, that it's built on sand, and that it has no future. Now, I don't underestimate the extent to which the best of critical scholarship in this field has taught us important lessons. Some of those are doubtless reflected even in the remarks I've made tonight. But I also don't underestimate how much of critical scholarship is formulaic and unfocused in meaningful or instructive ways on the real challenges that confront us and on the challenges that are becoming more and more real by the day in our world. I'm not suggesting that all human rights scholars should become activists, let alone cheerleaders. But I do think that all scholars should take responsibility for what many of the critical scholars warn others about, which is the problem of unintended consequences. It's a common and sometimes relentless refrain that human rights proponents don't take account of the unintended consequences of the positions they advocate. I suggest that critical scholars also need to take account of the unintended consequences of a lot of the work that they do. Finally, and I'll end my comments on this note, I think for me the most important question is what each of us can do. I don't think we need to sit back and wait for others to move. I don't think we can or should be dependent upon our governments, because governments are never at the forefront of protecting human rights. I think we need to work out what each of us can do. And the reality is that every one of us can, in fact, do things in small ways. It might be as minor as a financial contribution. It might be working for a particular group. More importantly, it might be in our work simply taking a decision that we're going to stand up and raise an issue. We're going to question it. We're going to ask that it be re-examined. There's always something that we can do, but most of us don't. We have the big divide between our theory and our own narrow little practice. I want to finish by going back to the situation in the Philippines that I described earlier. The group that should have stood up to the death squads in Davao City and should have called Rodrigo Duterte to account was the Philippines Human Rights Commission. But they didn't. They were cowards. They told me that they had no evidence that there was a death squad. I told them that I had more than enough evidence. They said, we're not convinced and we can't say anything. About a year after my visit to the Philippines, a new chairperson of the Human Rights Commission was appointed. Her name was Leyla De Lima. She immediately reversed the policy. She held hearings in Davao City. She was told that she'd be killed if she did so. She went ahead with the hearings, and evidence started to accumulate. De Lima was subsequently appointed as Minister for Justice in the Philippines and continued to stand up for human rights. In the middle of last year, at the same time as Duterte was elected president, De Lima was elected to the Philippines Senate, a powerful body, more powerful than our own Senate. In her role as committee chair, she began hearings into the killings, now estimated, 8,000 people, alleged drug dealers, drug users, who have been killed basically at the instigation of President Duterte. The response was swift. The president first exposed what he claimed was the fact that she had an affair with her driver. This is, of course, a matter of the utmost importance, which the president of the country should be following very closely and providing details to the media about. I would think that it was trumped up from my knowledge of Senator De Lima. But more importantly, he filed charges. He charged that when she was Minister for Justice, the visits that she'd made to prisons had been for the purpose of selling drugs. Leyla De Lima has been in prison for the last 8 or 9 months in Manila. Not much is being done. The president is crowing, as we say, and has proclaimed that he will get her and pay her back. I think he wants to send a message to the rest of the country that you should shut up. But the really powerful message, of course, is the one being sent by Leyla De Lima. And that is that each of us can stand up, not as dramatically as she has, not at such a heavy price, but in our voting, in our general advocacy, and in our daily activities. And so when we look around us and see such major threats to the human rights enterprise, I think the responsibility basically comes back to each of us. Thank you.
As always, an outstanding presentation, Philip, and reminding us in Australia, in Melbourne, in one of the most livable cities, of the challenges that we have to think about and the contribution we can make as well. We have some time for questions, so if you could please raise your hand. Microphones are roving, and stand up, state your name, please, affiliation, and keep it to a question, not a comment, please.
My name's Julian McMahon. I'm a barrister and I work in numerous Asian countries, so thank you very much for your talk. I think you had a lot of great wisdom in that talk. My question goes back to what you didn't say early on in your talk. You explained the rise of populism that we can see around the place, and you defined it sensibly, but I was hoping you would spend a minute or two prior to that. Why is it happening now in so many countries simultaneously?
Okay, a very good question. Implicit in my comments is that the human rights community has not been as effective as it should have been in terms of building up a set of values, a community which would make it much harder for this sort of descent into authoritarianism to have taken place. I think, there are endless articles and books and so on being written about this. My own view is that economic insecurity is the principal driver. I'm not, to put it in broad terms, anti-globalization, etc. But I do think that even most economists now recognize that very little was done to try to cushion the more brutal consequences of forms of globalization that have taken place. And what we see today is, and this particularly affects our own societies, including Australia, is the dramatic growth of economic insecurity. The old certainties of being able to afford a house, of having health insurance, of having annual holidays, of having certain protections at work are starting to disappear for many of us. And so many people are beginning to feel that they are on their own, that government is no longer there to protect them, and they seem to have then sought some dramatic alternative. Populists are, by definition, able to appeal to popular prejudices, beliefs, or whatever, and persuade people that through authoritarian means they can devise a brighter future. So for me, one of the major challenges is precisely to start addressing those different forms of economic insecurity.
Up the very back. Is it Di? Yeah, Di. Yeah, thanks, Di.
Thanks, Philip. Hi. I'm Di Otto. I teach human rights law in the law school here. I think there's another threat to the human rights regime as we know it that you didn't mention, and that's that many populist movements also use human rights language to promote their agendas, so that often nationalism and xenophobia is expressed in rights terms, the rights of the existing nationals or the rights of the dominant racial group. And further, many populist movements actually have women's equality in their platforms as a kind of anti-Islam sort of indicator. And some even have support for gay and lesbian rights. So I wondered what you thought about how to respond to this threat to the human rights regime as imagined in the Universal Declaration.
Good question. I mean, I'm not sure how many of the populist regimes that I have in mind are big on LGBTI rights or are genuinely big on gender equality. I think one of the more depressing things, in fact, and I certainly don't need to say this to you, Di, of all people, is that the misogyny that has come out of a lot of these regimes is really a striking characteristic. So the use of human rights language, of course, it's appropriate in a way that the appeal to a constituency can invoke the fact that their rights are being denied, whether it's by minority communities who have come into the country, whether it's by other ethnic or racial groups or whatever. But I think all we can do about that is not to try to deny them the opportunity to use rights language, but to insist that it be used properly. In other words, you can uphold the rights of people like me, elderly white males. Those rights are important. But they don't need to be, in fact, they're most important, but they don't need to be defended on the basis that they are not compatible with the rights of other groups. And that's the risk, and that's what we need to point out. So I don't think there's a way around the abusive usages of human rights rhetoric, but just an obligation on our part to ensure that it's put into its proper perspective.
Thank you. Dr. Alston, my name's Claire Brolin. I'm a long fan of your work. I work with the Della Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. I wanted to ask you a question around the rise of populism of metrics over human rights and international development. You wrote a very insightful and incisive piece around the MDGs and that human rights and development were akin to ships passing in the night in the implementation and operationalisation of the MDG agenda. Do you hold out any hope for the SDG agenda and its operationalisation?
I could have asked you to ask this question in a way, and I can now speak for an hour on the subject, but I'll spare you that. One of the things that I have been campaigning about, I suppose is the word, and I intend to do more of it in the months ahead, is to focus on the fact that, to take just two institutions, but they happen to be dominant in their fields, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they both are the leading thought shapers in the field of development. They both take the position that in their work they can have nothing to do with human rights. Human rights are political, and what they do is not. It's economic, it's technical. And so what they're promoting are ideas of development, ways of addressing the new Sustainable Development Goals, which can be treated completely separately from human rights. I think this is a really enormous problem. I think it influences the way in which governments think about these issues. It certainly influences what happens on the ground in both developed and developing states. And I think that as long as that separation persists, it's going to be very difficult for the new Sustainable Development Goals to really effectively engage with the human rights dimensions of what needs to be done. And of course, my view is that if you're really trying to promote development, if you're trying to alleviate or eliminate poverty, the only way forward is through respecting the rights of the individuals. And in order to respect them, it helps a lot if you can acknowledge that those rights exist in the first place. So as long as there's not acknowledgement, it's going to be very difficult to achieve development goals in a way that is compatible with respect for human rights.
Okay, it's 7 o'clock now, so it falls me to say thank you to Philip. Philip visits Melbourne regularly, and I obviously like catching up with him for a whole range of sort of personal reasons, but one of the most important things is he constantly inspires me. He's been working in this space for nearly 40 years now, and always get very tired. Melbourne gets cold, gets miserable, it's wet, but he comes across and you hear the stories of what he's doing, and it's always extraordinary. And he won't probably like me saying this, but he's an extraordinary man who's very, very courageous. And I think it's important for the students and those of us out there who are looking for inspiration that sometimes it's important to be reminded that it is a struggle. It does take time, and a lot of C's come up. Challenge, complacency, collaboration, commitment and contribution. And I think that's what he leaves with tonight, the idea that we can make a contribution. How we do it depends on our own situation and circumstances, but it's a real challenge as well. So thanks for sharing your insights. Thanks for sharing your time on your annual leave and your family time. We're ever so grateful. Thank you, Philip Alston. Thank you.